Alright, hello again folks. Welcome back to Skyscraper Games. I'm here at the skyscrapergames.com editor. So I'm on the editor page, and basically at this point we have a fully functioning game where you chase where the dot chases your player around. You can move the player, and then at the end when you get caught it displays your speed and the time. So now the next two lessons are going to be about functions and lists. So this is kind of optional, but it is a little more advanced, but also a way to make your programs a little more efficient and just work a little better in general. So if you haven't done lessons 1 through 11, you want to load in the code from lesson 11 from the site. And now if I run this, just to remind us of what it does, I've got my blue dot, which is my player that I'm controlling with the W, A, S, and D keys, and I can move diagonally. The red dot is chasing me, and it'll get faster and faster until it finally catches me. Alright, so that's how the game works. Now, we're going to make a function to simplify some of this a little bit. There's a couple reasons to make functions. One reason is if you find that you have the same amount of code repeated over and over, it's a good place to make a function. Also, if you have some code that you think you might want to use later on in a different program or in a different way, it's another good reason to make a function. And basically, it can also help simplify code so that if you find, for instance, an error or want to add an enhancement, you only have to do it in one place later instead of in multiple places. So in this case, there's a couple of good candidates for functions. I'm going to start with all this code for moving the player around, where I've got all these ifs. If it's, the x is greater than the lower limit, or then subtract 1. If the y is greater than the y lower limit, subtract 1. I have a feeling that all of that code I can make a function that will kind of simplify what we're doing and make it a little more clear. So the other thing I want to show you is right now we're at 152 lines of code, so that'll be important to remember for later. So to make a function in this class, we just use the def statement. So def, and I'm going to call this function movePlayer. Now when you're making a function in the class, you always have to include self as the first parameter. When you call it, you're not going to explicitly pass it self, but it basically says, let you access all those variables we made for this instance of a game object. And in this case, I just want one other parameter called direction. What I'm going to do with that direction is I'm going to have it be used to tell me if I'm moving up, down, left, right, or diagonal. Alright, so it's going to look something like if direction equals 1, and we'll say that's to move up, and so on. So basically, to do this, I'm going to just put in the skeleton of what I want to do. If direction equals 2, and notice you have to use the double equal sign to say if it is equal to, instead of, otherwise it thinks you're trying to do an assignment, like assign it to be equal to that value. We'll say 2 is down, and really these numbers could be anything I wanted them to be, but this is the way that makes, you want them to be in some logical order. So I'm just going up, down, left, right. And then we also have our diagonals. So if direction equals 5, we'll say move up plus left. Six will be to move up plus right. 7 will be to move down plus left, and 8 will be to move down plus right. Alright, then I'll just come up here, and basically the first one, this is up plus left, so I want to cut that code out of there, and I'm going to call self.movePlayer, and my direction up plus left I said was 5, I think. Yeah. And I'll just paste that code that I cut right in there. Alright. Down and left, which is going to be, I believe, 7. And the next one is up plus right. Should be 6. And then, so I just collapsed that. So we've got down plus right, which was 8. And then we have just moving it to the left, which was self.movePlayer down 3. We have just moving it to the right, which was number 4. Now, almost done here. Moving up, number 1. Moving down is number 2. Alright, so if I wanted to, I could go through and reorder my if statement here so that they were in order, 1 through 8. It might make sense to do that, and I might do that later, but for now, it doesn't, we don't have to do that, so I'm not going to right now. I just want to make sure this works. I can still move right, it stops me. Still move down, it stops me. Still move left, it stops me at the end. Alright, still move up, and then I can move diagonal, 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 diagonal. Alright, so everything still works. Now remember, before we were at 152 lines of code, and now we're at 170. So we didn't really make it that much shorter yet, but as I'm doing this, I can see now that there's some things I can do for this movePlayer function that's actually going to make it a lot simpler and a lot more direct coding. So probably better coding and probably use less resources. Basically, I'm going to look anywhere I see a y minus 1. I'm going to include that in my if statement. So if direction equals 1, or, this is where I can start to combine, anywhere else I see a y minus 1. Direction equals 5. Or direction equals 6. If self.y is greater than self.y lower, self.y minus equals 1. Alright, now I want to do it the same thing for anytime the y is plus. So if direction is equal to 2, or direction equals 7, or direction equals 8, if self.y less than self.y upper, self.y plus equals 1. Now the same thing for x. So anywhere I see an x minus 1, which is going to be 3, 5, and 7. If self.x is less than self.x, is greater than self.x lower, self.x equals self.x minus 1. And then I'm going to do the same thing for adding. So adding 1 to x. So that's going to be 4, 6, and 8. So direction equals 4, or direction equals 6, or direction equals 8. Self.x is less than self.x upper, self.x equals self.x plus 1. Alright, so now I should be able to run this and it should do exactly the same thing. And now you see I'm at 153 lines of code, so I actually only went up 1 line of code from what I originally started with. If you think about it, I added in all these lines, so I actually simplified it quite a bit, assuming of course that it works. So let's see. Okay, I can go over and go down, to the left, up, and diagonal, yes, yes. Alright, so that seems to have worked. So that's just one example of how the function helps. Now I could put all of this code without a function. I could still do it using the different combinations of get key, but it kind of makes a little more sense to have it separated out. And then this way, if we find errors or need to change it, we can. I would also point out to you that another pretty good candidate for a function are these two groups of code that move the computer player, because they basically are doing the same thing. They're checking a variable that the computer player has against a variable that the player has, and then either adding or subtracting one from that variable. So the only real difference here, if you look at these two groups of code, is between the whether it's an X or a Y. So that would be our next, I think, candidate for making that into a function. And I would love it if you would try to do that on your own and see what you come up with. All right, and then in the next lesson, we're going to talk about lists.